In this video, I'm going to go over the three main ways I was able to reach $1.1 million in assets by the time I was 25, and I still have some time to go. I currently have around $1.1 million in assets, and that's across 4 real estate properties, and then about $150,000 in stocks that is split between my retirement accounts and then my taxable accounts as well. What's left over is mostly cash. But I want to talk about how I actually got to this point because it's definitely very achievable depending on what your priorities are and what you're trying to do. The first and probably largest reason I've been able to get to this point is because of debt. Now remember, this is $1.1 million in assets. I did not say $1.1 million in net worth, and that is a key distinction because if you actually add all of my liabilities into this, my personal net worth is a few $100,000. Now debt is simply an obligation to pay someone else in the future, but the question should be, what kind of debt is this? And the vast majority of this debt is long-term fixed rate mortgages used to buy the 4 properties that I currently own. Actually, one of those properties doesn't have a loan on it. But for 2 of those properties in just the last 13 months or so, I was able to acquire them with 95% financing, which means I only had to bring 5% as a down payment for both properties. So I was able to acquire 2 fairly large properties relative to my net worth, even though I didn't put a ton of cash into them. It was only 5% of the deal. Now that probably is raising some eyebrows, and it should, because that is a lot of debt. 95% of the property value when I bought it was debt, at least based on the price I was getting it for. But I bought these properties with the assumption that one day they would become rentals. That was definitely the case with the last one, since I knew I wasn't going to be in the property for more than a year or so, because that is the amount of time you need to stay in a property when you say you're occupying it as a primary residence, although you can get some exceptions to that rule. But when I bought the property, I was able to get really good financing terms because I was an owner occupant, so the lowest down payment options as well as the lowest interest rates fixed for the longest periods of time. And I'm able to keep that financing even after I move out, which makes it a little bit easier to get a profitable rental because I now have better loan terms than I might have had if I was investing straight up as an investor, where you have to bring more down and you have to usually pay higher rates or more fees, and the deal becomes a bit harder to make work. So even though I have a lot of debt, that debt is being paid down with the rental income I'm bringing in on the properties that I no longer live in. So in that way, I was able to use some of the consumer options available to me as a potential homeowner, and I was able to turn that into an investment vehicle since I bought the house with the intention to live in it for some time and then rent it out after I would inevitably move out. I also house hacked my very first property, which kept my housing costs down while still allowing me to get into the real estate game. I did that a few years ago right out of college, since you didn't have to bring very much down, since I only had to bring 5% to the table. That was the sort of catalyst for getting started in real estate, since I could buy the property, I could control some real estate, I could get used to the rental property game, and I could also offset my housing costs in the meantime so that I could go acquire more property. So it would have been a lot more challenging to acquire this amount of assets without the debt options available in the real estate industry here in the US. But as I accumulate more debt, as I acquire more assets, I'm making sure to keep reserves on the side so that if for some reason I don't have enough rental income coming in, if I lose my salary for some reason, I still have money that can sort of weather the storm while I get back up on my feet or while we get the property back up and running. Whenever you take on debt, you're introducing a risk of going to zero, because if your asset values fall to nothing and you lose your cash flow, you can't make the debt payments and the debt's still there, so it has to be paid. So any amount of debt is a risk. The greater the amount of debt, the bigger the risk, but the terms also matter a lot too. Is that debt callable? In the case of a margin loan on stocks, that's typically callable debt, in that if your stock values fall enough, the brokerage or whoever's giving you that margin debt can actually call that debt due and force you to liquidate your stocks if you don't actually provide the cash to pay back the margin. That's not the case with my long-term fixed rate real estate loans that are nice and subsidized by the government, so that I don't have that same risk. But they still do have risk. Just because it's long-term doesn't mean it's risk-free, because I still have to pay this back. But debt has been instrumental in this whole process. Now, the second way I was able to acquire this much in asset value over the last few years is that I have put the vast majority of my income towards buying more assets. Even while I was in law school, I was working part-time, and that income was going towards buying more stocks, buying more real estate, or saving up for a real estate property. I've kept my expenses low relative to my income, and though my expenses have grown in absolute terms, I'm spending more than I did 3 years ago on my lifestyle. My income has also grown a lot since then because I was in school years ago, and the growth in my income has outpaced that increase in consumption and spending on things that don't actually move the needle when it comes to increasing asset value. value. On the real estate side of things, I've tried to make it a goal to buy about a property each year, and that requires me to set aside a large portion of my income each year. And I've poured thousands of dollars into some of these properties, so I have to have cash ready to go, and the only way I could do that is if most of the cash flow that I'm bringing in via my salary and then via the other investments is actually being put away or invested in other things that I could tap into later. If I spent it on a bunch of needless things, I wouldn't have that cash available to then invest in the property, to then improve it, or to weather a storm. So I've been putting the majority of my income towards buying assets. And the last main reason I've been able to reach this level of assets is that I've been focusing on increasing my income during this entire time. Like I mentioned, I was in law school pretty recently, and just a couple of years ago, I was making very little, but because I was going to law school, I was trying to increase my marketable skill to become an attorney so that I could then start making more money than if I didn't have a law degree. I've been also trying to become more knowledgeable about real estate, since that is another way to drive potential income. We now bring in something like $1,100 a month between all of our properties, and that number should go up soon because we just moved out of one, so it should be more like $1,200 or $1,300 pretty soon. And it also doesn't include all the cash reserves we're building for each property at the same time. But when you increase your income, not only do you have more cash at your disposal coming in each month so that you can then use it to invest in things, you also increase your capacity for debt and taking on bigger payments to pay for properties. I'm not saying you should max out the amount of debt you can take, but when you increase your income, you increase your capacity for debt too, and that debt can be used productively to buy productive assets. Or you don't need to use debt. The cash is yours to choose what to do with, after you pay taxes, of course. But just a couple of years ago, my wife and I were combining for something like $40,000 a year between a couple part-time jobs. I was working full-time for some of the time I was in law school, but I've since graduated law school, got my law license, and now my wife is about to start working full-time, and now we're well into making six figures, which can be used to buy more assets. But anyways, those are the three big reasons I've been able to reach $1.1 million in assets while I'm still 25. The three reasons being: 1, debt; 2, putting most of my free cash flow into investments; and then 3, focusing on increasing my income. Anyways, thanks for sticking around. Like, comment, all that great stuff, and until next time, take care.